Brilliant.
So Tim, this week you asked us, or you asked the learners, to explain why in 2013 Antarctic sea ice extent was at its greatest. But this week we found out that it's actually maybe at its lowest extent.
Well, thank you, because happily we've got my co-educator Damien Menzel in to answer that one.
Yeah, thanks team. So the question was set up in the course when Antarctic sea ice was doing something quite different to the Arctic, and the skeptics used to really look at the Antarctic sea ice and say, well, why is the sea ice extent increasing? Because the Arctic sea ice is well known decrease. So what's happening in Antarctica? And when the course came out, that was the trend. The sea ice in the Antarctic was slowly increasing, but last year was completely different again. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to update you. I've produced some graphs.
Good man.
And I've got satellite data from yesterday, so we're bringing you bang up to date. This is from the National So Nice Data Centre.
Okay, I can be your dashing assistant.
We'll start with the Arctic.
I'll probably get this wrong, you know.
Here we got data showing the sea ice extent in million square kilometres on this axis, and then the months of the year along here. And you can see the data goes from 1978 to 2016 in blue, and then we've got the magenta, and red is the most recent 2017 data. Basically, you can see this huge seasonal cycle in Arctic sea ice extent, and you can see here the 2012 record low, and you can see currently where we are here in February. I guess the notes from here are that from late October, the last year's sea ice extent was actually the lowest for that time of year ever on record. So it might not have been the overall lowest, but for that time of year, it is the lowest, and currently is now. For February, we've got the least amount of Arctic sea ice ever for this time of year
for
in
winter.
the satellite record.
Yeah.
So what's going on in Antarctica? Well, as I've said already, at the beginning of this century, the sea ice was actually increasing. Now you've got to remember that these are very different scenarios. You've got the Arctic Ocean, which is frozen over, whereas you've got the sea ice surrounding Antarctica. These large ice sheets. So here the hypothesis was that sea ice extent was increasing due to changes in circumpolar winds, pushing the sea ice away from the continent. Last year, however, that wasn't the case, and the overall sea ice extent started to actually decrease towards the end of last year. So going against the trend earlier in the decade that the sea ice extent was increasing. But what this graph doesn't show is where that sea ice is decreasing. Yeah. And actually this recent loss in extent of sea ice is mostly focused to one area in Antarctica.
Right.
And that's around the Amundsen Sea area. And that's a bit of a concern because the West Antarctic ice sheet is a tipping point in the Earth's climate system, which we will look at in more detail later on in the course. But other areas around Antarctica, like the Weddell Sea, are pretty average over the time period. So it's more interesting to look at Antarctica and go, well, where is the sea ice at its record lowest? What I've done with the data is I've combined these two graphs, the Arctic and the Antarctic sea ice extent, to produce a combined polar sea ice extent graph. Now, if you want to demonstrate the impact of climate change, then this graph does it really well. So we're combining these two sea ice extent data sets, so you can see that why there's these double peaks because of the seasonality. Where this red line here is the 2016 sea ice extent, and you can see here the jump at the end of the year. Now, again, I'm referring to a graph here in million square kilometres. So we're looking at like close to 3
million square kilometres.
Million square kilometres gone. And that's a combination of the fact that you've got a decreasing Antarctic sea ice extent, but also a record low for that time of the year. Now, that was last year, and look where we are now in 2017, completely off the scale again. So we're starting the year at record low combined, record low Arctic, and record low Antarctic.
Wow.
So the sea ice story is amazing as to research, but not a good story when it looks to evidence.
You heard it here first, folks.